There's a particular kind of loneliness that only exists in the presence of love. You know, the feeling where someone is right there beside you, maybe holding your hand or looking at you with eyes that see more of you than anyone ever has. And yet something inside you is already preparing for distance. Your body is already calculating the exit, already building walls from materials you didn't even know you were carrying. The pulling back starts so quietly, you might not even notice it at first. A slight withdrawal when they lean in, a joke that creates space when the conversation gets too real, a sudden need to check your phone right when they're offering you exactly what you've been searching for. And here's the cruelest part. You don't want to do it. You're not trying to hurt them. You're not playing games or being manipulative. And if anything, you're confused by your own behaviour. 3 a.m. finds you lying awake, wondering why you can't just accept what's being offered. Why you turn cold precisely when someone gets warm. Why your body tenses when it should soften. Why you find reasons to create problems when everything is actually okay for once. This isn't about not loving them. Sometimes it's because you love them so much it terrifies you. Something about being truly seen makes certain people feel exposed in a way that borders on dangerous. When someone looks at you with genuine affection, with real presence, with the kind of attention that says, "I'm here and I'm not leaving," it touches something so tender inside you that your entire nervous system screams threat. Not because they're threatening you, but because the vulnerability itself feels like standing naked in front of a crowd. So you push, creating distance not because you want space, but because closeness feels like too much sensation for a body that learned early on that love and pain often arrive holding hands. You might pick a fight over something trivial, or suddenly remember all their flaws and imperfections while cataloguing them like evidence in a case you're building against your own happiness. You might withdraw into silence, into work, into anything that creates a buffer between you and the terrifying intimacy of being loved as you actually are. And that's when something shifts. When there's finally distance, when they've pulled back and you can feel them protecting their own heart, the panic subsides and you can breathe again. In that space, you suddenly remember all the reasons you wanted closeness in the first place. So you reach out, you soften, you let them back in until it happens again. This cycle isn't random. It's not a personality flaw or a relationship problem or proof that you're broken beyond repair. What you're experiencing is a pattern, one that makes perfect sense when you understand where it comes from. A language your nervous system learned long before you had words. A survival strategy that once kept you safe, but now keeps you alone. The person you're pushing away isn't the problem. They're just standing too close to the wound. Until you understand what that wound is, until you can turn toward it with something resembling compassion instead of shame, you'll keep repeating the same dance. Getting close, feeling panic, creating distance, feeling lonely, reaching back out again and again, while wondering why love feels like something you have to survive rather than something you get to experience. But here's what matters. Recognizing the pattern is the beginning of changing it. Seeing yourself in these words, feeling that uncomfortable recognition settle in your chest, that's not proof of failure, but proof of awareness, and awareness is where transformation quietly begins. Before you learn to speak, you were learning about love, not from words or explanations or conscious lessons, but from the wordless exchange between your tiny, helpless body and the people who were supposed to catch you when you fell. You were learning whether the world was safe, whether your needs mattered, whether crying brought comfort or frustration, or nothing at all. And here's what most people don't realize. Those early experiences didn't just shape how you think about relationships, but shaped how your nervous system responds to them. They created pathways in your brain that still fire today, decades later, whenever someone gets too close. If you learned that love was conditional, that you were valued only when you were good or quiet or convenient or impressive, then somewhere deep inside, you internalized a devastating equation where the real you is unlovable. The real you with your needs and fears and messy emotions is too much. So you learn to hide, to perform, to show people only the parts of yourself that seemed acceptable. And now, when someone loves you without conditions, when they see beneath the performance and stay anyway, it doesn't feel like the relief it should be. Instead, it feels like they've made a mistake, like they don't really see you, like when they finally discover who you actually are, they'll leave. So you push them away first before they can realize the truth you've been carrying, that you're not worth staying for. Or maybe your early love was unpredictable, sometimes present and sometimes absent, sometimes warm and sometimes ice cold, and you never knew which version would show up, so you learned to brace yourself constantly, to never fully relax into safety, because safety had a habit of disappearing without warning. Your child self made sense of this the only way a child can, by believing you controlled it somehow. If you were better or smarter or quieter or more lovable, then maybe they'd stay. Maybe their attention wouldn't wander. Maybe you'd finally be enough to make them stay present. That belief doesn't leave just because you grow up. It lives in your body as a low-grade anxiety that hums beneath every intimate moment. And even now, when someone is fully present with you, some part of you is waiting for them to disappear. Waiting for the moment when their attention shifts and you're alone again, so you create that distance yourself. Because at least then, you're in control of the leaving. There's a particular wound that comes from being loved inconsistently, where affection arrived on someone else's schedule, based on their mood or availability, or whether you'd performed well enough that day. You learn to earn love like currency, to monitor constantly whether you were deserving, to track every interaction for signs that you were losing value. And now when someone offers steady, unconditional presence, your system doesn't recognize it because it feels foreign, suspicious, too good to be true. Every cell in your body knows how to navigate inconsistent love since that's familiar territory, but consistent love feels like waiting for an earthquake. So you test it, push it, create the inconsistency yourself, because at least then it's a pattern you know how to survive. Some people learned that closeness itself was dangerous, that letting someone in meant losing yourself, that love required the erasure of your own needs and your own voice and your own boundaries. Maybe you watched a parent disappear into a relationship and become smaller and quieter until you barely recognized them. Or maybe you experienced early relationships where intimacy felt like suffocation, where someone's need for you consumed the space where you were supposed to exist. So now when someone wants to be close, your body reads it as a threat to your autonomy. Not because they're actually controlling or demanding, but because somewhere deep in your wiring closeness and self-erasure got tangled together, and love became synonymous with losing yourself. Pushing someone away feels like the only way to remember who you are. The truth is, most people who push others away aren't avoiding love. They're avoiding the feelings that got paired with love long before they understood what was happening, avoiding the fear and the disappointment and the shame and the suffocation that their nervous system learned to expect whenever someone got close enough to matter. Your younger self was trying to survive. They developed strategies like hypervigilance and emotional shutdown and people-pleasing and maintaining distance, strategies that made perfect sense given what they were experiencing. Those strategies kept you functioning when you had no other options and protected you when you were too small and powerless to protect yourself any other way. But strategies that save us in childhood often imprison us as adults. The walls you built to keep out pain also keep out connection. The emotional distance that once protected your tender heart now creates the very loneliness you're desperate to escape. And the testing and pushing that helped you prepare for abandonment now triggers the abandonment you're trying to avoid. And perhaps the saddest part is you're not even conscious it's happening most of the time. These patterns run so deep and feel so automatic that they seem like truth rather than learned behavior. Like this is just who I am rather than this is what I learnt to do to survive. But here's what needs to be said gently and clearly, without judgment. You're not broken. Your system is doing exactly what it was trained to do, protecting you from what once hurt you using the only tools it developed when you were too young to develop better ones. The question isn't why you push people away. The question is, what were you protecting yourself from? And is it still happening, or are you fighting ghosts? There's a moment that happens right before you push someone away, a split second where something shifts inside you, where your body registers danger even though nothing dangerous is happening. It feels like suddenly remembering you left the stove on, like standing at the edge of a cliff, like that dream where you're falling and you jerk awake with your heart racing and gasping for air, except you're not actually in danger. You're just sitting across from someone who loves you. This is what fear looks like when it's not about external threats, when it's about the internal collapse that happens, when vulnerability exceeds your capacity to tolerate it, when being truly seen feels more dangerous than being alone. For some people, the fear whispers a simple, devastating story. They're going to leave eventually, so why wait for the inevitable? If everyone leaves in the end, and your history might have taught you that everyone does, then getting close is just delaying pain. Every moment of happiness becomes heavy with the weight of its future absence, and every "I love you" carries the echo of "but they won't always." So you create the ending yourself. You orchestrate the distance and manage the leaving, and maintain some illusion of control over the one thing you've learned is ultimately uncontrollable, which is other people's choice to stay. It's a terrible kind of power, but it's power nonetheless, and at least you're not helpless while waiting for abandonment to arrive on someone else's schedule. But there's another fear that lives on the opposite end of the spectrum, one that's equally powerful, and that's the fear of losing yourself entirely, of being consumed, of someone needing so much from you that there's nothing left for yourself. This fear makes closeness feel like drowning, like being slowly erased, like every step toward intimacy is a step away from your own existence. When someone wants more time or more emotional availability or more of your inner world, it doesn't feel like love, but feels like obliteration. You pull away, not because you don't care, but because you care so much about the fragile sense of self you've been protecting. You've learned somehow that to be loved means to disappear, that your value lies in meeting others' needs, while your own needs become invisible even to yourself. So distance becomes the only place where you can still recognize your own outline. And that's when the most painful fear of all emerges, the bone-deep conviction that you don't deserve what's being offered, that the love coming toward you is based on a misunderstanding, a mistaken identity, a version of yourself you've carefully curated, but that isn't real. You know all the things about yourself that you've kept hidden, the shame you carry like stones in your pockets, the parts of your history you're sure would repel anyone who really knew, the thoughts you have that feel too dark, or too needy, or too much to be acceptable. And when someone loves you without seeing all of that, part of you feels like a fraud. So you sabotage, showing them the darkness and forcing them to see the parts you're convinced will drive them away. Not because you want them to leave, but because waiting for them to discover the truth feels unbearable, and it's better to control the revelation than to live in constant fear of being found out. There's a particular agony in feeling unworthy of love, while simultaneously, desperately wanting it. It creates an impossible situation where you reach for connection, but flinch when you receive it, where you ask for closeness, but panic when it arrives, where every moment of genuine intimacy triggers an internal alarm that screams, "This isn't for you, you don't get to have this." They'll realize soon enough that you're not enough. What all these fears have in common is the way they hijack the present moment with stories from the past. You're not actually responding to the person in front of you, but responding to the ghost of every person who left, every relationship that taught you love was dangerous. Every moment when vulnerability led to pain instead of comfort. Your body doesn't distinguish between past and present when it comes to emotional threat. The same circuits that fire when you're in actual danger fire when you're just afraid of potential danger, when you're anticipating hurt based on old wounds, when you're experiencing intimacy that your nervous system was never taught to process as safe. So when someone reaches for you with gentleness and with consistency and with real affection, your fear doesn't analyze whether this particular person is trustworthy. It just remembers that reaching was dangerous once, that opening your heart led to abandonment, that being vulnerable meant getting hurt, and it does what it was designed to do by protecting you the only way it knows how, by creating distance, by building walls, by pushing away the very thing you're longing for, because longing feels safer than having and losing. The cruelty of this pattern is that it confirms the very fears it's trying to prevent. When you push someone away because you're afraid they'll leave, and then they actually leave because you push them away, it feels like proof that you were right all along, that people always leave, that love isn't safe, that you were correct to be afraid, but you weren't predicting the future. You were creating it. Until you can recognize fear for what it is, not truth and not prophecy and not evidence, it will continue writing your story. It will continue making decisions about your relationships based on information from relationships that ended years ago with people who aren't even here anymore. The question isn't whether the fear is real because it's very real. The question is whether it's accurate, whether the person in front of you now is actually the threat your body believes they are, or whether you're just afraid of being happy. The pushing away never announces itself. It doesn't arrive with a clear declaration of, I'm scared, so I'm creating distance now. And instead, it disguises itself as something more reasonable, more justified, more like a response to actual problems, rather than the fear of not having any. You become critical, and suddenly their laugh is too loud, their texting habits annoying, their way of loading the dishwasher unbearably wrong. These imperfections which you found endearing just weeks ago now feel like evidence that this person isn't right for you, that you're settling, that you need to reconsider everything. It's convincing because some of it might even be true. Maybe they do have flaws and maybe there are real incompatibilities, but the timing reveals the truth, since these observations don't arise from calm assessment. They arrive precisely when intimacy reaches a threshold your system can't tolerate, when things are going well, when you're feeling safe enough that vulnerability becomes possible, when the walls start to come down and your fear realizes it's losing control. So your mind, loyal servant of your fear, provides you with reasons and with evidence and with a case against a relationship that feels rational and measured, but is really just panic wearing a suit. Or you withdraw emotionally while staying physically present. You're there in body, but absent in spirit. Conversations become surface level. Your responses lose their warmth and their curiosity and their real engagement, and you stop sharing what's actually happening inside you. When they ask if something's wrong, you say, I'm fine, in a tone that means anything but. This is perhaps the most insidious form of pushing away because it's invisible. There's no argument to point to and no clear moment of rupture, just a slow dimming of connection, like someone's gradually turning down the lights and hoping no one notices until the room is dark. You're there, but you've taken yourself away. You've pulled your emotional presence back to some interior room and locked the door, and the person who loves you is left standing outside, confused about what changed, wondering what they did wrong, trying to reach someone who's already gone. Some people pick fights seemingly out of nowhere. Everything's fine, and then suddenly it's not. A casual comment becomes an accusation. A minor disappointment becomes proof of a fundamental problem, and you find yourself saying things designed to hurt, to create rupture, to build distance through conflict, because distance through withdrawal wasn't working fast enough. These fights aren't really about whatever you're arguing about. They're about needing space but not knowing how to ask for it. About feeling scared but only knowing how to express it as anger. About testing whether this person will stay even when you're difficult, even when you're pushing, even when you're being the version of yourself you're most ashamed of. It's a terrible test, and deep down, you know it. You're creating the very behavior that might drive them away, and then watching to see if they'll leave, proving to yourself that you were right to be afraid, or desperately hoping they'll prove you wrong by staying anyway. Then there's the escape into other things. Work suddenly becomes all-consuming. A new hobby demands all your attention. Plans with friends take priority over time together. And you're not technically avoiding them because you're just very busy, very needed elsewhere, very occupied with things that conveniently require your absence. The efficiency of this method is that it gives you cover. You're not pushing them away, but just living your life. You're not creating distance, but just pursuing your goals. But your calendar tells a different story. Every commitment you make to something else is an uncommitment to them. And every hour you fill with other activities is an hour you don't have to sit with the discomfort of intimacy. Some people sabotage through comparison. They talk about their ex a little too much and a little too fondly. They mention people who are attracted to them and frame it as innocent information sharing, but let it land as a subtle threat. And they keep one foot out the door by maintaining connections that blur boundaries, by staying emotionally available to others in ways that create questions about their emotional availability to you. It's not usually conscious infidelity, but maintaining escape routes, keeping options open, not because you want those options, but because commitment feels like being trapped, because going all in means risking everything, because if you never fully close other doors, you never have to face the terror of having only one. And that's when the preemptive ending happens. When things are at their best, when you're closest, when everything is actually working, that's when you start talking about how maybe this isn't sustainable, how maybe you're not ready for this, how maybe you need to be alone to work on yourself, and you package it in self-aware language about not wanting to hurt them, about needing to be healthy before you can be in a relationship, about timing being wrong. But the real message underneath is simpler and more painful. I'm leaving before you can. I'm ending this before it ends me. I'm walking away while I still have some control over the narrative. What makes all these patterns so difficult to recognize in yourself is that each one comes with its own justification. Each one feels like a legitimate response to legitimate concerns, and maybe somewhere in them there are legitimate concerns, but the pattern reveals itself not in any single action, but in the repetition. In the way these behaviors consistently emerge not during actual problems, but during actual intimacy. You push people away when things are good because good feels dangerous, because happiness feels like standing on the edge of a loss you can't survive, because every moment of connection is also a moment of vulnerability, and vulnerability is the thing you've been avoiding your entire life. These patterns are languages, the way you communicate fear when you don't have words for it, the way you ask for space when you don't feel entitled to need it, the way you protect yourself when you can't trust that anyone else will. But they're languages the other person can't translate. They just experience the distance and the coldness and the confusing withdrawal of someone who claimed to care, and they don't see your fear. They just see your actions, and slowly, inevitably, they start to protect their own heart. They pull back to match your distance, and they stop reaching, because reaching only meets air. And that's when you're both alone, even though you're still together. Both wanting connection, but caught in a dance where one person's fear triggers the other's, creating exactly the disconnection you were both afraid of in the first place. The cycle sustains itself not because you're broken, but because you're scared. And because fear, left unexamined and unspoken, will always find a way to protect you from exactly what you need most. Understanding why you push people away doesn't immediately stop you from doing it. Knowledge alone won't rewire patterns that were carved into you before you had conscious memory. And reading these words won't erase the neural pathways that fire automatically when someone gets too close. But understanding changes something. It creates a small gap between impulse and action. A pause where there wasn't one before, a moment where you can recognize this is the fear rather than believing this is the truth. That gap is where everything changes. It starts with the willingness to catch yourself mid-pattern, to notice when the criticism starts flowing, when the withdrawal begins, when the urge to create distance arrives right on schedule, and not to judge yourself for it, since judgment just adds shame to fear and makes everything heavier, but to simply notice, oh, there it is, the fear right on time. This noticing requires a kind of gentle attention that might feel foreign at first. You're so used to being at war with your own patterns, frustrated by them, ashamed of them. But transformation doesn't happen through force. It happens through the soft acknowledgement of what's true, even when what's true is uncomfortable. The next part is harder, staying when everything in you wants to run. Not forcing yourself to be okay with intimacy you're not ready for, but also not automatically obeying every impulse to create distance. Just staying in the discomfort long enough to realize it's not actually dangerous. Long enough for your nervous system to update its understanding of what closeness means. This staying looks different for everyone. Maybe it's taking a breath before sending the text that would start a fight. Maybe it's noticing the critical thoughts about your partner and asking yourself if they're true or if they're convenient. Maybe it's saying out loud, I'm feeling scared right now, instead of finding reasons to leave the room. The vulnerability required for this is enormous. It means letting someone see not just your fear, but your patterns, saying, I have a history of pushing people away when things get good before you do it. So when the impulse arrives, you've already named it. You've already made it something you're both aware of, rather than something you're enacting in secret. It means learning to speak the feeling instead of acting on it. I'm feeling overwhelmed by how close we're getting is different from withdrawing without explanation, and I'm scared you're going to leave. So part of me wants to leave first is different from picking fights until they do. Words create bridges where actions build walls, and it requires something that might seem impossible at first, self-compassion. The ability to recognize that you're not being difficult on purpose or manipulative by design or broken beyond repair, that you're carrying old wounds that developed their own protective strategies, that you're doing your best with a nervous system that learned to associate love with danger. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior and doesn't mean you shouldn't work on changing patterns that hurt people you care about, but shame never healed anything. Beating yourself up for pushing people away just gives you more pain to protect yourself from, and self-compassion creates the internal safety that makes external vulnerability possible. Sometimes you'll still push, even with awareness, even with intention, even with all your effort to stay present. Sometimes the fear will win and the pattern will activate, and you'll watch yourself do the thing you promised you wouldn't do. You'll create distance and build walls and retreat into the familiar discomfort of isolation. When this happens, the work isn't to be perfect, but to come back, to acknowledge what happened, to repair what you can, to try again with a little more awareness than before, and to understand that change isn't linear. It's not a steady march toward being fixed, but a gradual rewiring that happens through repeated experiences of choosing differently, even imperfectly. The truth is, you might always have to work at this more than people who learned early that love was safe. Your nervous system might always need a little more time to settle and a little more reassurance that staying is okay. And that's not failure, but just your particular path. But here's what's also true. You can have relationships where your fear doesn't run the show, where you're aware of the impulse to push away, but you don't have to obey it every time, where the person you love knows about your patterns and loves you anyway. Not despite them, but with full knowledge of them. You're not too damaged for connection, and you're not too afraid for love. You're just someone who learned to protect themselves in the only way available at the time. And now you're learning new ways, slower ways, braver ways. And that's not just healing, but the quiet revolution of choosing vulnerability in a life that taught you to choose safety. Of letting someone stay close, even when your entire history says to run. It's the most terrifying and most beautiful thing you can do.